And thank to you guys for being here, first of all. Applause to everybody here. And to the organizers as well, I guess, for having a political scientist here. Just kind of a change up in the mix. Yeah, for giving the opportunity to present some work that I've been conducting with a bunch of other researchers from different disciplines. So a sociologist who's, I think, also, in the audience, Moritz Houghton. And he's working on his presentation for 5 o'clock today. So he might just be focusing on the questions at the end, all the hard questions that way. So maybe just a bit of like my background. I've been kind of putting together groups of scholars from different disciplines to look at some of the more tricky governance issues in the blockchain space. Stuff that you guys are probably all thinking about and addressing in different ways, but perhaps not theorizing in the ways that academics approach this stuff. So this volume was kind of one of the first ones out that's taking on these questions of governance from mostly theoretical perspectives, but not too crazy theories. So there's some practical stuff in there that might be of interest. This book is actually open access. So feel free to just download it for free or buy the hard copy, which is like retailing for like 100-something pounds, kind of ridiculous. But there's also a paperback version out recently that's a bit cheaper. So yeah, that's kind of my thing, is like putting together different academics to take on these really challenging issues that are faced in the kind of technological innovation space. And so the project that I want to talk about today is a bit more specifically looking at this issue of de-risking. And this is one of these issues that's kind of seemingly come out of nowhere after the financial crisis. World Bank, a lot of development organizations have been focusing on that recently. And the US Federal Reserve actually put together a workshop in December, bringing together practitioners, academics, all kind of pondering what this issue is, how can we resolve it, and what are the roles of technologies like blockchain in kind of confronting this issue. But maybe just first of all, like, does anybody know what de-risking is referring to, or care to venture a definition of what that might be? Yes.
Leverage, maybe. Less leverage?
Yeah, less leverage, yeah. From whose leverage?
Well, the banks do.
Right, yeah. Especially, I guess, after the crisis, right? I mentioned that as well, right? So deleveraging kind of fits into there. And the role of banks is pretty big, yeah. Did that spark any ideas or comments from others? Yeah.
Maybe not venturing into less developed markets, just because of the risk there of success. So staying to more where there's more volume and more liquidity, I guess, or where there's more adoption already. Yeah. And I guess that's maybe part of the subject.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why World Bank and all these development organizations are interested in this as well, right? Yeah, so thanks. There's the developmental focus, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a sec, but thanks for bringing it up. So, we're academics, and like we got to be really precise with our definitions, so I'll just kind of put a boring one up here, but I'll tease it apart and get to the kind of juicier, spicier stuff in a second. But, just generally, we're talking about like decreasing engagement with financial services firms generally, with markets that are perceived to pose more risks than are justified by the potential rewards that they're getting out of these markets, right? So this is leading to like reductions or like complete withdrawals from certain markets. And where those markets are super important, mostly they're in the global south. And so there's a lot of contestation over this definition. Like the Fed workshop was really interested in like, are we talking just about debanking? That was like a big debate at the Fed, like should we actually just narrow down on what the banks are doing, or talk also about like what payday lenders, remittance firms, et cetera, are also doing, which is basically financial exclusion. That's the kind of key term that keeps coming up in this literature. And most of the debates tend to be focused on what are the causes of this. A lot of it tends to kind of point towards, surprise, surprise, regulation being the cause of all the problems, right? So specifically anti-money laundering regulation and the increased costs of compliance with all the different regulations and new sanctions that are coming out. And so there's the costs not only that are financial when certain banks get fined, but also like reputational costs comes up a lot in these discussions, right? So the causes is like a huge debate, and it's one that we're kind of less interested in this research. Our focus is really on kind of the solutions that are coming out of this. And what we argue is that the solutions really depend on where you look, right? There's not just going to be like one general solution to the de-risking problem, but we really need to look at like specific regions and specific places and see how the different solutions fare in those regions. So when we actually look at like where de-risking is taking place, it's mostly taking place in the global south broadly. And we broadly see banks from the global north, US banks, Swiss banks, Canadian banks, et cetera, that are pulling out of these regions. So top right chart here, just giving some numbers on like the termination of corresponding bank relationships in the Caribbean. And definitely the Caribbean is one of the most affected regions here. So our work is really focusing on a specific sub-region within this region, the Eastern Caribbean in particular. And we're comparing that to another region of Eastern Europe, sub-region, so the Baltic states. And any guesses why the Baltic states kind of came to our radar or might be affected by de-risking? It's been in the news recently. Russia, yeah, for sure, yeah. Just a really small money laundering scandal, for instance, right? Danske Bank and its Estonian branch. So there's been this perception that these are states that pose a great threat, as far as regulatory hammer coming down on certain institutions for lending in these regions, right? So I'll come back to the cases in a minute, but what I want to do is kind of situate this a bit more broadly. We get to kind of think about the broad kind of questions in academia a lot more. So partially what I've done in the presentation is try to give us the larger overview of why this matters. And we really situate this within like the legitimacy crisis of like Western-based finance more generally, and how they can provide financing to like developing countries or developing regions, right? And if they're withdrawing from those regions, what challenges does then that pose for the legitimacy of Western-based finance more generally, right? So that kind of fits in with like obviously all the crises that Western-based finance has been going through. And obviously there's a whole bunch of books that kind of attest to that 10 years after the crisis, right? So you have that plus like the kind of perceived abuse of US dollar hegemony over the past few years in particular that are kind of making all these other alternatives attractive in these regions particularly. So definitely in the Eastern Caribbean, but also in the Baltic states, you have a greater role of like Chinese-backed finance, right? And here the big difference is, of course, that the state plays a much more prominent role, and for sure a different kind of state, less democratic state, et cetera, right? So this is kind of the wider context that we're situating this in. I'm an international relations specialist, and so I see this contestation between like Western-based capitalism and the more kind of authoritarian capitalisms that are coming out and providing different alternatives. But there's also the role of Europe, obviously, in all this too, that's kind of in the middle ground. So this is not just stuff that like academics are talking about. You have central bankers, current and former, they're also talking about this stuff. And that are really situating, the alternatives to the different forms of money within this kind of wider contestation, okay? So then kind of within that larger context, we're talking about a specific question here, which is really how blockchains can kind of help overcome de-risking in manners that don't further kind of re-risk the legitimacy or the perceived legitimacy of Western-based capitalism. So we're talking about that in the specific context of like digital financial inclusion, but also this kind of larger issue of Western or Anglo-American led finance more generally. And to kind of not hide our argument, we're really focused on how like multiple publics have to be involved in these issues and how they have to kind of have inputs, genuine input. They also have to benefit from these programs. And so we have to have kind of financial inclusion that takes locals on board and not just kind of just mentions them in passing, right? So this idea that relying on technology is important. There's obviously a role of technology, but we can't just have technology. And this is kind of the controversial point. There has to be some role of the state, right? and specifically the democratic state, as opposed to, say, the authoritarian alternatives that the Chinese finance is providing, and where you have a lot less freedom and a lot less legitimacy because there's obviously less input from the people that are supposed to benefit from these projects. So really, just generally, when we're talking about legitimacy here, we are referring to like specific types of legitimacy. Anybody know like Abraham Lincoln's famous dictum about democratic governments? At the Gettysburg Address, he was mentioning how government can be democratic when it's for the people, by the people, et cetera, right? So this is kind of what we're building on when we bring up these academic concepts of like input legitimacy, throughput legitimacy, and output legitimacy. And we really just touch on two of these in our work, input and output. And so kind of just briefly in the time that remains, I'll maybe just go through how we operationalize this stuff. So first, with input legitimacy, we're really just talking about, are all stakeholders not just kind of involved in a token manner, but like genuinely participating in the decisions that are going to affect them, right? So actively involved in the content of decision making. And so, we're all aware of blockchains. And so what might be some of the ways that blockchains are enhancing this participation? Top of your heads. Yeah.
I'm not sure what you're. So you're asking how can we use the technology that is blockchain to have more participation, right?
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I think from my small experience, it seems that even if you have blockchain-based participation, which is usually related to governance, there's still the same problem of getting people interested in making informed decisions, right?
Right.
And especially when you ask them to vote on or to have a say on so many different things where they can't possibly do that. And so then it defaults to having a representative, which then goes back to a similar system to what we have today, where you have representatives, and then the issues with that, are they actually representing you or not when they're trying to represent a group of people?
Yeah, that's good critique as well, yeah.
And so
There's
that
definitely
I've seen a lot of projects are thinking we're going to have a token, and then we're going to have our members or our token holders vote on decisions of where this should go. And the participation rates so far have been very, very low from what I've seen. I don't know if anyone else thinks differently.
Yeah, there's definitely that dichotomy between like theory and practice, right? That, like theoretically, we could have all these great things, like as far as participation goes, right? But in practice, as I'll get to, for sure, there's going to be issues and risks, right? So maybe just for the sake of time, I kind of build off of that point that, like theoretically, you can have this participation, you can have this idea that like the code is open, et cetera. Anybody can harness it. I mean, there's all these different applications that get thrown around as far as participation goes, right? Like e-democracy, e-voting, liquid democracy, all these kind of things, right? And that's in theory. And then in practice, sometimes we see different things, right? But definitely here, like in the regions that we're looking at, we do see some potential for these technologies to overcome de-risking for like the use of cryptocurrencies, for instance, cryptocurrency exchanges that are like local to the region that have like input from locals harnessing these technologies. So this is just like one project that's been around for some time, hasn't really taken off, but the idea is like it could benefit from it, Carib Coin. You've got like this similarly named Carry Coin, which is like a social messaging platform, but also like crypto remittance functions are with there. And here you have this idea that like it's created specifically with like locals in mind and that you're benefiting locals, et cetera, right? In the Baltics, you have a lot of kind of leading Baltic entrepreneurs taking on some pretty prominent roles in the industry. Maybe you know some Estonians amongst yourselves, but Estonians, Latvians, et cetera, are pretty prominently represented, I'd say, for like small countries, et cetera, right? And then here's where we get to kind of the risks that you're bringing up. So this idea of like complexity is one of the problems that comes up here, that like, sure, everybody can participate, but you might not have the required knowledge or like training, et cetera, right? There's also like the material problems, right? That you need access to the internet, you need access to a smartphone, computer, et cetera. And there's these real world digital gaps, right, that sometimes get overlooked, right? So within just the Eastern Caribbean, I got up some data on the screen here, but it's kind of just a reminder that like, you know, you have places like St. Lucia where like percentage of computer usage is like at 35% of the population, right? So, you know, you can kind of scroll through these stats. I can give you guys the PowerPoint, but these are just kind of some reminders that like these are really divided regions where, you know, inequality is quite high, for instance. And there's not just that access that a lot of times is assumed everybody can have in order to participate in these projects, right? So, you know, the financial divides that might be less in some parts of the world are very prominent in the ones that we're looking at, right? And so that obviously affects like who can participate in these projects, right? So for instance, then when we see like the participation that's local or that's framed as local, well, when you drill down, there's often like a large role of foreigners in these projects. So, I mean, the Caracoin is one that's like, you know, from a company that has its headquarters here in London. Another kind of prominent player in the Caribbean region is BIT, which is actually from just outside the Eastern Caribbean, but kind of markets itself as a Caribbean firm. And it's gotten a lot of financing from Medici Ventures. So Overstock is big in that as well, Utah-based blockchain or online retailer, et cetera. And that's, I guess, its former CEO, blockchain evangelist, right? And so, you know, you can kind of go down the list, and a lot of the functionality that you see in the region is provided from foreign firms. Alpha Point, like New York City-based firm. Netkey, like you can kind of keep just going down the list here, but for the sake of time, I think you guys get the point, right? That a lot of the key components that we're seeing here being provided by outsiders, and it kind of leads to, in some cases, these critiques that like what we're talking about is actually a form of like crypto colonialism. This was like really stark in the case after the hurricane in 2017. In Puerto Rico, for instance, you had a lot of like Bitcoin billionaires that are setting up this kind of low tax utopia called Sol on the island. So again, this is kind of speaking to the issue of legitimacy within these projects and how they're perceived by locals, and you know whether they're involving locals or not, or whether it's just outsiders coming in and taking advantage of the region or not, right? So kind of the main headline points is really about like local inclusion in these projects and how much locals are actually actively being engaged. So that's on the one side. And then the other side would be like how much they're actually benefiting from these schemes. So I can get to that in a minute. But when we think of like, okay, what could we do to resolve this? Like what could we do to really overcome these problems? There's some other solutions that come to mind. And does anything kind of pop into your heads as far as other solutions to address like those divides and to get like more local participation? Yeah, you got the mic, so. Yeah.
No? Well, I had you could have a project that provides the infrastructure, but then requires it to grow from a local base, if you know what I mean. So I think there was this old, like older project called Kolu or something like that, where you could stimulate local economies by giving them their own currency or something like that. And so in a way, you still provide that infrastructure that's still permissionless, etc. But you have in that mentality of it has to grow from that locality, and that's maybe a way to solve that.
Yeah, that could be cool. Yeah. Amir. Yeah.
Just a question on that. I mean, if it's based on the local currency, does it necessarily have to be geographically manufactured or used there? Because surely even if it's from a source somewhere else or someone else, but they're basically increasing the value of that local currency, which will then help those who are using that local currency. Is that necessarily, I mean, that's still helping them, right? It's creating legitimacy in that sense, in a theoretical sense.
Right, yeah. I guess so, I can elaborate on that a bit more in a bit, but the point about the Eastern Caribbean would be that they have this regional currency, the Eastern Caribbean dollar, right? And that you could say within an individual country, you know, the average citizen is quite far removed from the decision making from the ECCB, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. So it'd be like how much input can like local citizenry have within that monetary system, et cetera, right? So yeah, I mean, it's kind of an issue of distance, I guess, comes up as well, right? Yeah, yeah.
This got me wondering if you've made any unique observations with regards to regions like Catalonia, maybe Bavaria, Texas, places where people identify with their region first before their nationality.
That's a good point. Yeah, there's definitely room to expand this research into like regional studies and the sense of not just like nationalism, but regionalism, right? Yeah, that'd definitely be one of the insights from this research, yeah. But like any study, we're just limited right now in these two areas. Yeah, but yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, maybe just like one of the other solutions that comes up is often financial literacy, and that's something that the ECCB has been promoting a lot. And like at least within the academic literature, there's a lot of critiques of like literacy again being this thing that doesn't really resolve a lot of the structural issues, or at least when it is provided by the market, is just going to benefit those who can afford to, purchase, higher education, et cetera, right? So some of the argument that we make in the paper is that, there is this role for the state in providing this literacy. And, if you're going to be entering these regions and there are these massive socioeconomic divides, there's room to like work with local governments, et cetera, and to make sure that they can provide widespread education and not just for a certain like elite within the country that can afford it, right? So with that in mind, we kind of then contrast a lot of the stuff that's going on in the Eastern Caribbean with what's going in the Baltics. And there's room for like critique of this comparison on a number of bases, but they have kind of similar histories in terms of like colonial legacies from Russia on the one hand, mostly from the UK on the other hand. But here, like we just noticed that there's a lot more room for government involvement, and a lot of the kind of major infrastructural projects that they've taken on, at least in the blockchain space, have had really a lot of active involvement from the government. So the keyless signature infrastructure, the KCI blockchain technology stack, a lot of investments from the Estonian government, et cetera. But also with the Estonian startup Guard Time, doing work with the state, creating all these digital registries, et cetera. So this is like in healthcare, property, business registry, et cetera. So again, here it's the idea that like we're not just relying on foreign firms, but we have like active involvement of like a democratically elected government in these processes, right? And so you also have this in like the educational system in Estonia and a lot of the Baltic states where like coding is provided at a young age, financial literacy is provided. These are like state-backed programs from like early age. And so maybe just to like contrast these within a chart, which might be a little small, here like we're really just kind of hinting at like there's a lot of room for the state in these projects, even though there are obvious limits to what the state can and should do. We've seen this in the past. We should also just not dismiss the power of like a democratically elected state, especially in a small country like the ones that we're looking at. So yeah, as you can kind of also tell by this chart, we also have a whole bunch of points about output legitimacy, which maybe I'll just run through real quick and then maybe wrap up and get some coffee. But here we're really talking about like who gains from these projects. And this is like for me as a political economist, more this question of like who benefits, the classic political economy question, se bono, right? And whether those benefits are distributed equally. And so in many of the cases that we look at, we're trying to see, is it just, foreigners that are benefiting from these developmental projects that are involving blockchain in developing countries? Or is it like the locals themselves that are not just like participating, but actively benefiting from these projects? And for sure, like within, the theoretical realm, there's a lot of benefits that can be had, for overcoming de-risking more generally, tracking and tracing transactions, et cetera. But what we actually see, for instance, in the Eastern Caribbean, you could label as like this kind of race to the bottom, where there's like very little sort of state regulation on how they're raising financing in these areas. For instance, like we have Antigua's proposal for like the initial development coin. And for sure, this sounds great. Like they're trying to raise money for all these developmental projects, but there's like very little kind of oversight, say, on how that money is being raised. Like very little strings attached, you could say. And so we kind of compare that in our work to what's going on in Eastern Europe, where you have countries that are doing the opposite. They're kind of racing to the top as far as regulation goes, and making sure that like all the businesses that are trying to raise money through blockchain based applications are really trying to meet anti-money laundering standards and like overcome a lot of the issues that raised de-risking problems in the first place. So yeah, they're really trying to bring up their standards to European legal levels and to really kind of overcome this perception that they're like sketchy places for raising money, right? So this is one of the ways that like we think can overcome a lot of the risks that we see when you venture into blockchain-based financing more generally, right? So not getting your citizens into casino capitalism, the Wild West, whatever it is, right? But ensuring that they're also protected, right? And also raising money, raising taxation as well, making sure that the state and locals also benefit, right? And then there's, of course, the issue of privacy, right? That often gets addressed later as, for instance, like Facebook more generally attests to, right? That like it's not like an afterthought, but really at the core of a lot of these projects in the Baltics. Whether it's in the Eastern Caribbean, for instance, the pilot plan that the ECCB has to have like the first blockchain-based digital currency, really, to our minds, isn't foregrounding these issues as much, at least the issue of privacy and how locals can actually benefit from the digitization of their local regional currency, right? So just like headline argument from us is really that having wider sets of publics, so not just say like foreigners, not just like techies, but having like local inputs and local benefits is really key for like the legitimacy of these solutions. And if they don't have this legitimacy down the line, you'll have some problems, or even presently, right? And one of the ways to get over this would be like overcoming state phobia, or this kind of fear of the state, which is well-founded in many parts of the world, and for sure in like, especially Eastern Europe with like a legacy of authoritarianism, has well-grounded fears of the state. So this balance of like market and state is pretty important. So not just having, say, market-based financing options, but ensuring that the government is also part of the solution. So we just put like this one up here, this big question mark, and trying to make sure like we don't just have a question mark, but have something kind of solid and concrete going forward. And then just really summarizing the argument here about overly re-risking on the one hand. In the Eastern Caribbean, this is like a massive simplification of what we're trying to get at, but basically we're just trying to say that like you're trying to address de-risking by really overly re-risking the legitimacy of these digital development projects in the Eastern Caribbean. Whereas in the Baltic states, there's a bit more of a balance between like the risks that should be taken and can be taken to overcome de-risking, with like the potential downsides. So anyway, they're clapping, so maybe it's time to also wrap up here, right? Yeah, so thanks for your attention.
I said one quick one. Do you think, sure. I heard about a project in Tortolas in the British Virgin Islands where as a sort of first step to get people familiar, and I think it's partly educational but also partly charitable, so for disaster relief in the event of a hurricane where people don't have access to finances, they've distributed digital wallets to the population to start that sort of education process, but also have the functionality that when they're at their wits' end, they actually can rely on this for currency. And potentially, like, if it starts with a charitable end result, that will help the adoption and help build that trust. I wonder if that's maybe the way to get these projects sort of at least started in the right direction.
Yeah, that's a good one. What's the name of that project?
It's a very good question. I was hoping you weren't going to ask that. I can find out. I'll get your email.
Cheers. Yeah, I mean, I'd say like for sure that sounds great. It'd be just like you'd want to make sure that there's no abuses of something like that as well, right? That like there is some oversight, that like there's not, illicit actors coming in and taking advantage of the vulnerable, right? And saying like, let's collect their data for our own uses, or like, let's scam them, right? Because like, in this world, it's full of scams, et cetera, right? So yeah, like some kind of, whether it's government oversight or like some thought about like, these sound like great projects, but they also are open to abuse, seems kind of necessary still, right? So yeah, whether that's the government that's going to provide that oversight, or like, an industry actor or something, just having a clear line of like who's responsible when these things are either abused or, potentially go the wrong way. But not to dismiss and say like it's not necessary or it's not useful, but just to also think about potential downsides. Yeah, thanks. We'll get the name for that. Yeah. Cheers. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, thanks guys.